This is BBC News. The headlines at 11 o'clock. Unnecessary and wasteful. Doctors' leaders speak out against planned health reforms in England just days after David Cameron's assurances.
The NHS isn't just being cut to the bone, but whole limbs are being amputated. If you cut the legs off the NHS, what happens? It falls over.
A stinging attack on the government from the Archbishop of Canterbury. He accuses the coalition of forcing through radical policies for which no one voted.
So it would be nice if we'd seen a little more balance in his commentary to say, actually, the system itself is damaging the very lives that it's meant to seek to help.
Colonel Gaddafi's forces have been accused of using rape as a means of repression. A call for antipsychotic drugs to be used less on dementia sufferers. And the exam regulator says it's found unacceptable errors, including impossible maths questions in recent AS level papers. The Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, has attacked the government's plans to reform the NHS in England as unnecessary and wasteful. That's despite a series of changes outlined by David Cameron earlier this week. Speaking at the association's annual conference, the head of its GPs committee, Dr. Lawrence Bookman, said only major changes could make the proposals work.
The mess the UK government is in now could all have been avoided if they truly listened early on. But as usual, the last ones to be listened to at the point of implementation are ordinary GPs. Why do governments always run to enthusiasts and advisors with a vested interest first? The previous government did it repeatedly, and now this one is listening to those who are committed to the private sector and letting them help shape this government's policies. We too have been telling the government what we think, and we will know within a matter of days whether they've been listening to us. So where we are now is that there's only one way to get the NHS reforms to work with minimal private incursion into the management of NHS or supply of services. And that is to persuade MPs and peers to start again or to make major revisions to the bill.
Downing Street has rejected claims by the Archbishop of Canterbury that the coalition is forcing through radical policies for which no one voted. Writing as the guest editor of The New Statesman, Dr. Rowan Williams criticised key government policies in areas including education and welfare reform. He said ministers had created anxiety and fear and called David Cameron's big society agenda painfully stale. The government has insisted current policies are necessary to ensure Britain is on the right track. Here's our religious affairs correspondent, Robert Piggott.
Although by no means Archbishop Williams' first attack on government policy, his latest criticism is extraordinary for its breadth and as the most overtly political yet. He even questioned the coalition's use of its democratic mandate, claiming that reforms to health and education had been forced through without adequate public scrutiny. Dr. Williams called them radical long-term policies for which no one voted, and said they'd prompted an understandable anxiety about what democracy meant in such a context.
Most people in this country turned out to vote in local elections, in the referendums and so on. They had an opportunity to give the government a good kicking, and what happened? The Conservative Party actually increased its vote and increased its number of councillors. That doesn't sound to me as though the population is in the mood to revolt against the government's approach.
Dr. Williams singled out David Cameron's big society idea, one he supports in principle, for criticism. He said the policy appeared painfully stale and that there was widespread suspicion that it was an opportunistic cover for spending cuts. Downing Street said Dr. Williams' intervention was legitimate, but insisted that the government had been elected to tackle deep-rooted problems and had clear policies to ensure it did so. Senior figures in the coalition said Dr. Williams had the detail wrong.
Well, like me, he writes for The New Statesman, has interesting things to say, but I think the main point which he seemed to be making was that there wasn't enough debate around health reform, for example, which I don't understand because there's a very big debate. You know, my party's triggered it. We're having a pause, rethinking the reforms. So, he's obviously entitled to his views and it's welcome that he pitches into political debate, but I think he's actually wrong on the specifics.
not since Archbishop Robert Runcie attacked some of Margaret Thatcher's policies in the 1980s has an Archbishop of Canterbury made such outspoken criticism and so political in tone. But Dr. Williams regards many current political issues as matters of social justice and will see his role as akin to that of the nation's conscience. Robert Piggott, BBC News.
A High Court judge has refused to lift an order which stops journalists naming a woman who had an affair with former RBS boss Sir Fred Goodwin. He was head of the Royal Bank of Scotland when it collapsed in 2008. News Group Newspapers, which publishes The Sun and the News of the World, has been trying to get the privacy injunction lifted after the issue was raised in the House of Lords. But lawyers for the woman involved have been fighting to keep her identity a secret. London Underground drivers are to stage 4 strikes in the coming weeks in a row over the sacking of a colleague. The RMT union claims that one of its drivers is being victimised. A Transport for London spokesman has called the decision completely mystifying. A joint report by the Chief Inspectors of Constabulary and Prosecutions has found that a third of offenders who should have gone to court were instead given cautions, fixed penalties or community work. The inspectors said there were wide variations in the way criminals were dealt with across England and Wales. The International Criminal Court has claimed that Colonel Gaddafi ordered his forces to use rape as a weapon in the conflict in Libya. It comes as the United Nations Human Rights Council meets in Geneva this morning to debate a report on alleged war crimes committed by both sides. Senior UN investigators will present evidence of murder, torture and indiscriminate attacks on civilians.